For the first time since the end of the Second World War, conflict returns to continental Europe. Inflation soars out of control, leading to financial uncertainty, business collapse, and labor unrest. And extreme weather pummels the world, from droughts and hot weather to extreme cold and flooding. Nearly everyone around the world experienced it. This is 2022 Year in Review. On February 24th, war returned to continental Europe after Russian troops poured into sovereign Ukrainian territory. The initial Russian invasion was widespread, with troops attacking from the north, south, and east, making a beeline for the capital, Kyiv. Russia's intention in the early days of the war was to topple Ukraine's democratically elected government. Their plans, though, would quickly derail after their troops met with fierce Ukrainian resistance and poor logistics from Moscow. By March 25th, Russia would abandon its initial assault on the capital and begin pulling troops out of the area in an attempt to regroup. By the middle of April, Russia would begin its full-scale invasion of the 4 provinces that make up the Donbass region of the Ukraine. With all of their military might focused on one goal, Russia would meet with more success, and over the following weeks they managed to gain control over large swathes of Ukrainian territory. While Russia would find initial success in the east, the Ukrainian people fought like hell, and with weapons and supplies provided by Western countries, they managed to halt the Russian onslaught and even beat them back in some places. The end result is a months-long stalemate, with troops hurling shells at each other from wet, muddy trenches, the likes of which we haven't seen since the First World War. With neither side backing down, this war is likely to continue for some time. Throughout the war, Russia has refused to fight fair. There is ample evidence of war crimes, murders, and other atrocities committed by Russian soldiers. There is the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, including at schools, in hospitals, and apartments. There is the continuous attack against Ukraine's energy infrastructure in an attempt to freeze civilians across the country. There was the relentless assault on the port city of Mariupol, turning it into little more than rubble, where once stood a city of more than 400,000. There was the irresponsible shelling alongside nuclear power plants, and of course the continuous stream of fake news and propaganda, from lies about biological weapons to false claims that the Ukrainian president was a Nazi. When the US and other countries labeled Russia a terrorist state, it really wasn't an exaggeration. Consequences for Russia's unprovoked invasion has been swift and wide-ranging. Construction of their Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline was halted. The entire country has been disconnected from the SWIFT banking system. The state broadcaster RT has been removed from satellite platforms around the world. A price cap has been instituted against Russian gas exports, and thousands of individual sanctions have been filed against Russian oligarchs and companies. Despite the backlash against the Russian Federation, their economy has actually fared better than many had predicted, particularly since countries such as China, Iran, and India continue to do business with the Russians. Iran, in particular, has been an enabler of war, selling drones and other munitions directly to the Russians in contravention of international norms. Russia's war against the Ukraine has created the worst refugee crisis since World War II, with millions of Ukrainians fleeing their homes and seeking safety in neighboring countries. Many of these refugees were welcomed with open arms by Eastern European countries, in sharp contrast to the way migrants from Africa and the Middle East were treated in previous years. Ukraine is a major exporter of grain. In fact, the country is often referred to as the world's breadbasket. With the Russian invasion, grain exports from the nation stalled, leading to a food crisis in countries dependent on Ukrainian exports. The situation got so bad that Russia was accused of food terrorism until a deal was finally struck to allow Ukrainian grain ships to safely leave via Turkey. And a final note on the conflict: Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has done a phenomenal job of governing during the war. Throughout the conflict, Zelensky has stayed at his post, directing the war effort from the capital instead of fleeing the country. World leaders have been lining up to take photos with the president, and Zelensky has been making the rounds, addressing parliaments and building support around the world for Ukraine. The sanctions against Russia, coupled with an ongoing supply chain challenge caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, a shortage of workers, and energy disruptions, has led to the worst level of inflation since the 1980s. In the US, inflation topped 8%. In the UK, it maxed out just shy of 12%. The meteoric rise in the cost of living has resulted in unprecedented labor disruptions, particularly in the UK, where striking workers are calling for higher wages. Nearly every sector has been affected, from the postal service to hospitals to transportation. Governments around the world have been trying to clamp down on inflation by raising interest rates to levels not seen in decades, which has helped somewhat, but has negative consequences for anyone with a loan or a mortgage. COVID-19 remains a strong disruptive force in our world. The year started with more than 1 million cases per day in the United States alone. As the year progressed and more people gained immunity to the virus, both through natural exposure and immunizations, the fatality rate began to drop, and people began to learn to live with the virus. By the middle of the year, day-to-day life for most people began to at least resemble what it did prior to 2019. One notable exception was in China. While the rest of the world learned to live with the virus, China pursued a relentless zero-COVID policy, which saw entire neighborhoods locked down if even a single case was discovered. These harsh measures led to widespread reports of people living without food and clean water or access to medical care. Frustrations against the policy finally bubbled over in December, when thousands of people took to the streets across China at a scale that hadn't been seen in decades. Following the demonstrations, the government relaxed some of the rules, morphing China's COVID response into something more in line with the rest of the world. Whilst the threat of COVID-19 waned, other viruses were waiting to take its place. After 2 years of lockdowns and limited socialization, many people, in particular children, had lost natural immunity to the flu virus, and by November, the winter flu season was in full swing. A potent flu virus, coupled with lowered immunity, social distancing fatigue, and a resurgence of the RSV virus, which affects children, led to healthcare providers across North America becoming quickly overwhelmed. In particular, the strain was great on pediatric emergency rooms. Not since the early days of the COVID pandemic has our healthcare seen such intense pressure. Here in Canada, we saw some of the most disruptive social unrest in decades after anti-vax, anti-science, and anti-government protesters descended on the streets of the capital, Ottawa. The protesters were angry about vaccine mandates and other anti-COVID-19 measures, but any legitimate grievances they had were quickly lost when anti-government extremists turned the protest into a multi-week-long occupation of the streets of Ottawa. The agitators terrorized blocks of city streets, blared truck horns at all hours of the day and night, used the public streets as a toilet, and generally made life a living hell for residents of Canada's capital. Ottawa police were seemingly unable to break up the situation, and the standoff lasted for weeks. Agitators elsewhere in the country drew inspiration from the occupation and would fire up their own protests, at one point even blocking the busiest border crossing in the country. The federal government finally acted on February 14th, instituting the never-before-used Emergencies Act, which gave unprecedented powers to police, and by the 18th of February, the occupation was finally dismantled. Elsewhere around the world, copycat protests against COVID-19 sprung up, with demonstrations taking place in Paris, Amsterdam, Auckland, New Zealand, among others. While the demonstrators in these other countries tried to start an Ottawa-style occupation, police had other ideas and the rallies were quickly broken up. Outside of COVID-19, this year has seen a lot of political unrest. Beginning in January, protesters in Kazakhstan took to the streets angry about a sharp rise in petrol prices. The protests quickly escalated into anti-government demonstrations and turned lethal after troops from Russia and other Kazakh allies were called in to stamp out the protests. In the aftermath, more than 200 people have been killed. On September 16th, Masha Amini died after being beaten by Iran's so-called morality police. Her death sparked a wave of anger across the country, and mass demonstrations against the government would spread to every corner of Iran. The government has responded to the protests with brutal force, using live ammunition, tear gas, mass arrests, and torture to try and end the demonstrations. Despite the brutal crackdown, anger in Iran is palpable, and demonstrators have continued to take to the streets in an effort to make their point. More than 18,000 people have been arrested, 200 people have been killed, and now Iran has begun imposing the death penalty on those who have been arrested. In Sri Lanka, demonstrators began protesting in April. Angry about daily blackouts and fuel shortages, protesters have been calling for the resignation of senior government officials. While the government tried to suppress the demonstrations, the protests would continue for several months. After protesters managed to breach the presidential palace in January, the resignations of the Prime Minister and President were secured. The economic situation has improved somewhat in the country. On April 10th, Imran Khan was ousted as Pakistan's president after the National Assembly held a no-confidence motion against him. The vote of no confidence followed claims by Khan that the U.S. was plotting against him. In response to his deposition, Khan has held rallies of support and encouraged protesters to take to the streets and call for fresh elections. The United Kingdom experienced its own political turmoil after it was revealed that former Prime Minister Boris Johnson held secret parties in contravention of his own COVID-19 restrictions. Johnson would eventually resign on July 7th after more than half of his cabinet lost confidence. And following Johnson's resignation, the governing Conservative Party held a leadership race, after which Liz Truss was named leader on September 5th. On September 23rd, Truss would throw the UK into an economic crisis after unveiling a so-called mini-budget, which proposed deep tax cuts paid for by increased borrowing. On October 20th, Truss became the shortest Prime Minister in UK history after tendering her own resignation. Following Truss's resignation, Rishi Sunak was chosen as the leader of the party. Sunak has reversed the economic direction of his predecessor and has largely managed to stabilize the UK economy. In Peru, demonstrations broke out after the President Pedro Castillo was impeached and arrested after trying to dissolve Congress. The demonstrators are calling for fresh elections to be held, which has so far been rejected by the Congress. So far, 20 people have been killed in the ongoing violence. Political turmoil in Iraq bubbled over when supporters of cleric Muqtada al-Sadr occupied the Iraqi parliament. Al-Sadr's supporters were upset over the nomination of a Shiite for prime minister. The occupation of Iraq's parliament lasted for 2 days until July 31st, after which the demonstrators were cleared out. In January, a coup d'etat was launched in Burkina Faso, deposing the president and the parliament. The military was dissatisfied with the way the government was handling an ongoing Islamic insurgency in the country. Ironically enough, just 8 months later, Burkina Faso was faced with a second coup, which deposed the interim military leader. In May, Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by Israeli soldiers while covering an Israeli raid. Initially, Israel tried to deny responsibility, falsely claiming that Palestinian militants were responsible. Following international investigations, Israel was forced to admit responsibility, and after Abu Akleh's killing, Israeli soldiers attacked mourners carrying her coffin and attempted to violently suppress attendees. The killing has been condemned around the world. Australia experienced some of the worst flooding in recent memory. In March, extreme rainfall led to floods which caused mass damage across dozens of communities across the East Coast. 27 people were killed during those floods and in the aftermath. And following March's flooding, additional floods were reported in Sydney and other central parts of New South Wales, causing tens of thousands of people to become displaced. Climate change is being blamed for causing the worst flooding in Pakistan's history after the country received more than 700% of its average annual rainfall. Massive swathes of Pakistan were left underwater and more than 1,700 people died as a result of the flooding. The floodwaters also heavily damaged agricultural land and cost an estimated $15 billion hit to the country's economy. Here in North America, we were subject to extreme weather of all kinds. In January, rare winter wildfires ripped across Colorado, destroying more than 1,000 buildings. Later in the same month, winter storms would rip across the U.S. Northeast, dumping tons of snow on New York and other cities. The U.S. snowstorms followed similar extreme weather, which pummeled the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec, dumping more than 60 centimeters of snow in some locations. In May, floodwaters ripped across Western Canada, affecting 3 provinces and spanning an area from the U.S. border in the south to Great Slave Lake in the north. The spring flooding would then give way to a heat wave of epic proportions in the summer, which put more than 100 million people under a state of extreme heat alert. High temperature records were shattered across the continent, and extreme heat has been implicated in the deaths of thousands of people. North America's extreme heat was just one of dozens of instances of heat waves across the world. In Europe, temperature records fell after nearly every country was subject to intense temperatures. Japan, China, and other parts of Asia were also subject to extreme heat. All the hot and dry temperature around the world has led to droughts which hasn't been seen in thousands of years. In Germany, the Rhine River nearly dried up, causing shipping in the country to grind to a halt. And in Serbia, long-lost shipwrecks were uncovered after the Danube River fell to some of the lowest levels ever recorded. In China, ancient artifacts were uncovered after the Yangtze River dried up, and all of this drought around the world has very serious consequences, from a drop in food production to failed hydroelectric dams. The impact of drought can be felt all around the world. Of course, another consequence of dry weather is an increased risk of wildfires, and Europe would experience a worse than normal fire season with tens of thousands of hectares of forest burning. Brush fires were also reported in the UK, which is extremely rare. Hurricane Fiona made landfall in Puerto Rico on September 18th, where it caused widespread flooding and destruction across the island. After pummeling the Dominican Republic, it would then turn north and strike eastern Canada on September 24th. Fiona was the strongest recorded hurricane to strike Canada, and it caused devastation across the Atlantic provinces. Trees were uprooted, buildings destroyed, and as many as 500,000 people left without power. At least 214 people were killed in the Philippines when Tropical Storm Migay made landfall in April. The storm brought heavy rains which caused flooding and landslides across the country. Across Bangladesh and India, flooding is being blamed for the deaths of more than 300 people and the displacement of thousands. In February, a storm lashed the UK with winds of more than 120 kilometers an hour. At its peak, the storm caused 225,000 people to lose power. Flooding in April killed more than 300 people in South Africa after heavy rains hit the region. The floods caused roads to collapse, damaged buildings, and left thousands of people without access to drinking water. And in December, much of North America has been gripped by an extreme cold weather system that is being described as a once-in-a-generation storm. Frigid temperatures of more than 50 below in some places have gripped the continent, leading to massive airline delays and people becoming trapped in their cars. More than 38 people have been reported dead as a result of the cold temperatures. Every year, the world seems to experience more and more instances of extreme weather. Much of it can be traced back to climate change. If this and previous years are any indication, it is imperative that we get global warming under control, lest these type of weather events become the norm and become more severe. The United States is infamous for mass shootings. In fact, on average, there is more than one per day in the US. In 2022, a few stood out. In April, a gunman terrorized commuters in New York City after boarding a train and throwing several smoke grenades and firing rounds from 2 handguns. In May, a racist gunman murdered 10 African Americans at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. The 18-year-old gunman was motivated by white supremacist ideology. Just days later, in what was possibly the most horrific shooting of the year, 21 people were murdered after a gunman opened fire on the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Of the dead, 19 were children, and police failed to adequately respond to the attack, waiting for backup instead of stopping the shooter. And in July, 7 people were killed after a gunman opened fire on spectators of a 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Illinois. Also in July, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated in a political rally in Tokyo. Gun crime in Japan is exceptionally rare, and the shooter was found to be using a homemade firearm. A former police officer in Thailand killed 24 children at a daycare. The man was allegedly triggered after he went to the daycare to pick up his child and found that his child wasn't there. The shooter eventually went home and turned the gun on his wife and child before killing himself. And in France, on December 23rd, a 69-year-old gunman opened fire at a Kurdish community center, killing 3. Following the attack, demonstrators have taken to the streets to protest what they perceive as an improper police response to the shooting, leading to violent clashes with officers. People across the Canadian province of Saskatchewan were put on heightened alert after 11 people were stabbed to death on the James Smith Cree Nation and in the town of Weldon. The attacker also injured another 18 people and would go on the run following the attack, prompting a manhunt that lasted 3 days. While this attack is particularly horrifying, Canada's First Nation communities are no strangers to violence and other issues such as substance abuse. Many of these issues can be traced back to the residential school system in which First Nations children were forcibly sent to boarding schools where they were, in many cases, beaten, abused, and even killed. Most of these schools were run by the Catholic Church. And in April, the Pope apologized for the horrors of the residential school system. Following his historic apology, Pope Francis would then visit Canada and apologize directly to community members. Throughout much of the year, migrants have been arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border in an attempt to reach the United States. In June, 51 of those migrants died after being left in a tractor-trailer outside of San Antonio, Texas. It's likely the migrants died of suffocation and heat exhaustion after being abandoned by their driver. In a jaw-dropping reversal of women's rights, the U.S. Supreme Court in May overturned a 1974 ruling which made access to abortion legal across the U.S. In response, many Republican-led states have instituted either complete or partial bans on abortion access, turning back the clock on women's rights by decades. The U.S. Supreme Court has also been meddling in other aspects of society. In June, the court essentially neutered the EPA's ability to enforce environmental regulations, and the court also agreed to hear a North Carolina case in which the state attempted to redraw election maps to favor Republicans. The court is heavily criticized for falling out of sync with societal norms. In August, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi sparked a row with China after she became the highest-profile U.S. official to visit Taiwan. Officially, the U.S. is supposed to deal directly with Beijing instead of talking to Taipei, and Pelosi's visit angered the Chinese. Elon Musk is, by all accounts, an egomaniac addicted to attention, and he attempted to feed his addiction by purchasing the social media giant Twitter. Twitter's board initially refused the sale, but when Musk offered $44 billion for the company, they relented. Musk would then try and renege on the deal, but after court rulings in favor of Twitter, he was forced to go through with the purchase. Since November, Musk's Twitter has become unstable at best, with Musk firing half of the company's staff, eliminating content moderation, and reinstating racist and troll accounts. Musk would then totally fly off the handle in December when he banned the accounts of dozens of journalists and barred anyone from linking to alternative social platforms. Interestingly, extremist right-wing social media sites were not subject to the ban. Musk would then turn back all of his decisions after being faced with backlash. What was once one of the most popular communication platforms around the world has rapidly fallen off a cliff, and the problem of relying on a single centralized platform for disseminating information has become clear. One can only hope that in 2023, governments, NGOs, and media organizations are going to learn to rely less on a proprietary platform that is subject to the whims of a single narcissistic billionaire. As if one pandemic wasn't enough, monkeypox dominated the news cycle in 2022. The virus, which is similar to the smallpox virus, causes painful lesions on the skin of an infected person, but is rarely fatal. Fortunately, a vaccine for the virus exists, and it was rolled out to large swathes of the vulnerable population. The United States held its midterm elections in November, and despite record-high inflation, the war in Ukraine, and many other headwinds, the governing Democratic Party managed to make gains in the Senate and lose only a small number of seats in Congress. The seats they did lose, though, meant they lost control of the House, which will make President Biden's remaining two-year term a challenge. Of note, all of Donald Trump's hand-picked extremist candidates underperformed, meaning his stranglehold on the Republican Party might be coming to an end. In October, Brazil held elections. The contest was primarily between leftist Lula da Silva and extremist right-wing Jair Bolsonaro. In the end, Lula won by a razor-thin margin, and Bolsonaro would begrudgingly hand power over without expressly admitting defeat. In the Philippines, right-wing candidate Bongbong Ferdinand Marcos Jr. won the presidential election. Bongbong is best known for his father, who was a fascist dictator who ruled the Philippines until 1986. Not much is likely to change in the short term, as Bongbong has much the same ideology as his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte. Speaking of fascism, Italy elected its most right-wing government since the Second World War when Giorgia Meloni and her neo-fascist Brothers of Italy party swept to power following an election in September. Meloni's party is anti-European, anti-migrant, anti-LGBT, and pro-xenophobia. A stampede on Halloween night in South Korea left more than 150 people dead. The incident happened when hundreds of partiers flooded into a narrow alley in the capital, Seoul. The overcrowding was so bad that many people in the alley didn't even realize what was happening. In October, a riot at a football stadium in Indonesia killed 125 people. Some sporadic violence and a delay in opening the gates to the stadium resulted in panicked spectators rushing the pitch. The rush of the crowd prompted police to fire tear gas, leading to further panic. Police and stadium officials have been heavily criticized for their response to the incident. In September, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake struck off the coast of western Mexico. The quake occurred just hours before a scheduled earthquake drill, leading to confusion. For a period of time, the island nation of Tonga was completely cut off from the rest of the world after a powerful eruption of an undersea volcano on January 15th. At least 9 people were killed in the aftermath, and communications links to the island were cut off for more than a week. More than 300 people were killed in Indonesia after a powerful magnitude 5.6 earthquake struck off the coast of West Java province. The quake damaged more than 62,000 buildings and injured more than 7,000 people. The last thing Afghanistan needed was an earthquake, but that's exactly what the struggling nation got. More than 1,000 people were killed when a magnitude 6.2 quake struck the southeast of the country. The quake struck in a region prone to landslides, which likely contributed to the high death toll. In February, Ethiopia opened its Grand Renaissance Dam. The dam has a capacity to produce more than 700 megawatts of electricity, but is controversial because both Egypt and Sudan say that it will choke off the Nile River. Canadians got a taste of how fragile their telecommunications infrastructure can be when an outage of one of the national communications providers took place. On July 12th, Rogers Communications would push a configuration update that went horribly wrong, taking down its entire national network. Compounding the problem was the fact that many businesses, including Canada's national interbanking wire transfer service, had no redundancy in their networks. Most of Canada was plunged into chaos for 2 days until the company restored service. The British royal family was in the news a lot this year. In June, Queen Elizabeth II celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, marking 70 years on the throne, though it wasn't long before Buckingham Palace would then find themselves announcing her death. Love or hate the royal family as an institution, you had to at least respect the Queen's dedication to duty and love for the British people. The Queen's funeral was attended by hundreds of dignitaries and heads of state. Queen Elizabeth was the second longest reigning monarch in world history, the longest in British history, and died at the age of 96. Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle retired as working royals in 2020 after citing racism within the royal family and hostile treatment by the British media. In December of this year, Netflix released a documentary series about the couple in which they lambasted the royal family as an institution, the British media, and even Harry's own family. In February, Beijing hosted the 2022 Winter Olympics, making it the first city to host both the Summer and the Winter Games. The Olympics were held in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant that attendance was limited and it was difficult even for athletes to get into the country. It was a different story in November when the World Cup was held in Qatar. 2022 marked the first time the event was held in an Arab nation. In the end, Argentina would claim the top spot amidst much celebration in Buenos Aires. Scientists made history in December when, for the first time, a nuclear fusion reaction produced more energy than was required to initiate it. Fusion is considered the holy grail of clean energy because the only byproduct is harmless helium. The successful experiment is a proof of concept of the technology, which now needs to be refined into a finished product. The business world was rocked by the bankruptcy of cryptocurrency exchange FTX in November. The exchange allowed users to exchange different kinds of cryptocurrency and exchange crypto for fiat currency. Following the collapse of FTX, the cryptocurrency market crashed, with Bitcoin falling to its lowest level since December of 2020. Former CEO Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested on fraud charges after investigators determined that he was siphoning billions out of the exchange. An explosion in Istanbul left 6 people dead and 81 injured. No one has claimed responsibility for the attack, but the Turkish authorities are blaming Kurdish rebels, and they've used the explosion as a pretext to launch a ground invasion into northern Syria, which is controlled by the Kurds. And finally, let's end on a happier note. It was in July that people across Western Canada went bananas for these guys. The bizarre lawn ornaments are part banana, part duck, and were sold at drugstores across the region. The so-called Duck Anna caused a ruckus on social media, caught the attention of mainstream media, and even prompted some in-person meetups. Duck Anna is our media moment of the year because it just doesn't make any sense, but for some reason I can't stop staring at it. Banana ducks aside, 2022 is likely going to be remembered for the sheer volatility in our everyday lives. From the war in Ukraine to out-of-control inflation to political unrest and extreme weather, nearly every person around the world has had their day-to-day life impacted in some way. As 2022 draws to a close, I think we can all hope that 2023 will be just a little bit less interesting. From all of us here at iNet, human, animal, or banana duck, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in 2023.